Hollywood, 1972. A quiet restaurant in Manhattan. The kind of place where deals happen and secrets die with the people who keep them. Marlon Brando sits across from a man whose name matters less than his reputation. The man leans forward. His voice stays low. And he says something that should never be said to one of the biggest stars in the world. "We know what you did in that movie, and we want you to understand the consequences." Brando's hands don't shake. His face doesn't change. But inside, something crystallizes. He realizes in that moment that the role he just played, a role that would define his legacy, cement his immortality as an actor, has made him a target. Not by critics, not by rival actors, but by the actual American Mafia. The phone calls started before the film was even released. Subtle, threatening, designed to communicate one message: you crossed a line that should never be crossed. Francis Ford Coppola knew about them. He knew the danger was real. So he did something most directors would never do. He hired private security. Armed bodyguards. Not for protection during filming, but for protection after it. For decades, this story stayed buried. Coppola kept it quiet. Brando didn't talk about it. And the Mafia? Well, they had other problems to worry about. But the truth remained hidden in the shadows of one of cinema's greatest achievements. The Godfather wasn't just a movie that changed Hollywood. It was a movie that nearly got its star killed. Here is the story. To understand how Marlon Brando became a target, you have to understand what Hollywood was in 1971. The studio system was collapsing. The old guard, the men who built the industry through handshake deals and controlled narratives, were losing power. In their place came a new generation of filmmakers. Directors like Francis Ford Coppola. Younger, hungrier, willing to tell stories the old system had always suppressed. Coppola was 31 years old when he got the Godfather assignment. He wasn't the first choice. Nobody wanted the job. Studio executives thought Mario Puzo's novel was too dark, too real, too dangerous to adapt. They worried it would glorify organized crime. They worried about backlash. They worried about legal problems. So Coppola inherited a project nobody else would touch. A project that felt, to everyone involved, like a career bomb waiting to explode. But Coppola saw something different. He saw a genuine American tragedy. A story about corruption, loyalty, and the cost of power. He saw an opportunity to make something that mattered. Then he cast Marlon Brando as Don Vito Corleone. By 1971, Brando was considered washed up. He was overweight. His career had stalled. His last major role was 5 years behind him. He was, in the eyes of Hollywood, finished. Done. A relic of a better era. The studio executives fought the casting viciously. They didn't want to has been playing the patriarch of their mafia epic. But Coppola pushed. He knew Brando had something nobody else could access, a profound understanding of power, of control, of the weight of command. Brando understood complexity. He understood men who carried darkness inside them, but had reasons for carrying it. So they cast him. And Brando prepared for the role with an intensity that shocked everyone around him. He studied. He listened to recordings of mafia figures. He worked with dialogue coaches to perfect the raspy whisper that would become iconic. He lost weight. He gained presence. He transformed into Don Vito Corleone in a way that felt less like acting and more like channeling something primal. But here's what nobody anticipated. Here's the detail that changes everything about this story. The Mafia took the film personally. The Godfather wasn't fiction to them. It was a mirror, a documentary wearing the mask of entertainment. When members of the American Mafia, and yes, they existed very much in 1971, they were real organizations with real power. When they read Puzo's script, they didn't see a story. They saw their world being dissected and displayed for public consumption. They saw their secrets being turned into entertainment, and they knew exactly who would be the face of that dissection. Marlon Brando's portrayal of Don Vito wasn't just a character, it was a statement. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the deliberate, controlled violence beneath every gesture. Brando created a character so authentic, so genuinely powerful, that people couldn't help but understand why the Mafia controlled the territories they controlled. The film didn't condemn the Mafia. It explained them. And to people inside organized crime, that was far more dangerous than any attack could ever be. The calls started coming to Francis Ford Coppola's office. Not from studios, not from producers. From intermediaries, men with connections. Men who represented interests that existed far outside the entertainment industry. The message was consistent: tell Brando to be careful. Tell him there are consequences for what he's doing. Tell him that some people take this very seriously. Coppola was terrified. He understood what this meant. He understood that he wasn't dealing with industry politics anymore. He was dealing with something far more dangerous. The kind of people who didn't sue you. They didn't write angry letters to studios. They took action. They made examples. And Marlon Brando walked through it all with a kind of willful defiance that was both courageous and reckless. He knew about the threats. He knew about the calls. He knew about the danger. But he also believed, or perhaps he chose to believe, that art justified the risk. That telling a true story about power, even if it made the powerful uncomfortable, was worth the consequences. Quick question for you. Have you ever made a choice that you knew was dangerous? Where the voice inside your head was screaming to be careful, but something deeper, something about truth or integrity or just refusing to back down, made you push forward anyway? Because that's what Brando was doing. He was choosing to continue, to go deeper, even as the warning signs multiplied around him. Let me know in the comments if you've ever faced that kind of choice, because it matters to understanding what comes next. The studio kept the threats quiet. They didn't want press about the film being connected to actual organized crime. They didn't want the narrative to shift from artistic triumph to Hollywood under siege. So they made a decision that would only be revealed years later, when journalists and documentarians started digging into the real history of the Godfather's production. They hired security, private investigators, armed protection for Brando, and they did it all behind closed doors, never mentioning it publicly, never confirming it to the press, letting the world believe that The Godfather was another Hollywood success story. But underneath that sanitized narrative was something far darker. A genuine fear that one of the world's greatest actors might be harmed for the art he had just created. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in February 1972, 2 weeks before The Godfather premiered. Brando was at home. He wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. It was just a regular day in Manhattan. But then the voice on the other end of the line changed everything. We saw what you're doing. We know who you're portraying, and we want you to understand something very clearly. There are people who don't appreciate being turned into entertainment. People who don't like being mocked. People who take things very seriously. Brando didn't hang up. He listened. Because even through the threat, even through the implicit danger, he understood that this wasn't just some crank call. This was communication. This was a message from an organized entity. This was the Mafia, essentially, introducing themselves and making their position clear. And then the voice said, "We're watching. We know where you live. We know where you work. And if this movie affects our interests in any way, if it creates problems for our organization, there will be consequences." You understand. Brando understood. Now, while that call was happening, Francis Ford Coppola, was making his own discovery. He was meeting with producers and studio executives, and they were telling him things about the mafia's involvement in New York City that went far beyond veiled phone calls. They were talking about actual meetings, actual complaints, actual organized pressure being put on people associated with the film. One producer told Coppola, "There are people in this city who own half of everything. They own restaurants. They own construction companies. They own labor unions. They own pieces of the police department. And they're all very unhappy about what we've made." Coppola realized he had created something that hadn't just disrupted the entertainment industry. He had created something that had destabilized power structures that existed outside of Hollywood entirely. The Godfather wasn't a movie to the mafia. It was a threat to their carefully constructed public image. For years, they had existed in a kind of shadow world, acknowledged but not truly discussed, operating in ways that were known but not spoken about. And now, a filmmaker had created a portrait so accurate, so intimate, so compelling, that it threatened to transform public perception from abstract rumor to visceral reality. Here's where the story takes a turn that almost nobody knows about. Coppola didn't just accept the threats. He didn't just hope things would blow over. He took action. Real, concrete, physical action. He hired private security specialists. Not security guards who stand around looking intimidating. Actual professionals. Men who had worked for the government. Men who understood threat assessment and protection protocols. Men who could evaluate a situation and keep a person alive if things went bad. Brando's movement became restricted. Where he could go, who he could meet with, how he traveled through the city, it all changed. Suddenly, the greatest actor of his generation was living under a kind of protective watch. Not because he was paranoid. Not because he was imagining danger, but because the danger was real and documented. Think about what that means. Here's a man who has spent his entire career fighting for authenticity, fighting against artifice, fighting to reveal truth on screen. And now, in his personal life, he has to live behind a constructed facade of security and surveillance. He can't move freely through New York City, the place he loves, because the power structures he portrayed in a film didn't appreciate being examined. Some of Brando's closest friends didn't even know the extent of the security. His family was kept in the dark about the specific nature of the threats. The studio executives worried about the PR nightmare if this story leaked, so they created a kind of shadow world around the production. The film was made in one reality, but the aftermath was happening in another reality entirely. A hidden reality that involved phone calls and meetings and decisions being made behind closed doors about how to keep one of the world's greatest actors alive. Then something unexpected happened. The movie was released. And instead of creating the disaster everyone predicted, instead of destabilizing organized crime or creating public backlash that would lead to retaliation, The Godfather became a phenomenon. It became art. It became literature translated into cinema. And something shifted in the perception. The film was so powerful, so undeniably brilliant, that it transcended the threat. It became something that existed beyond the reach of any criminal organization. It became cultural property, untouchable, sacred, in a sense. The Mafia realized something that changed the calculation entirely. Trying to harm Brando now wouldn't silence the film. The film already existed. Killing him would only prove the point. It would only validate the very truth the movie expressed, that power in this world is maintained through violence and intimidation. They would be performing the exact narrative the film depicted. So they backed off. Slowly. Quietly. The calls stopped. The intermediaries disappeared. The threat didn't vanish so much as evaporate, like smoke that dissipates when the fire goes out. What Brando experienced during that period was a kind of trial by fire that almost nobody knew about. The security detail that protected him became part of Hollywood legend, but only in whispered conversations and unreleased interviews. For decades, this story remained hidden because everyone involved had reasons to keep it quiet. The studio didn't want to admit they were dealing with organized crime. The Mafia didn't want to admit they were concerned about public perception. And Brando, well, Brando was a complex man with his own reasons for not publicizing his suffering, but the impact on him was profound. He became more reclusive. He became more suspicious of the entertainment industry. He became less willing to engage with the machinery of Hollywood celebrity. Some biographers have suggested this period marked the beginning of his withdrawal from public life, the moment when he started to turn inward, to reject the demands of stardom. Was that a coincidence? Or was it a direct result of learning that creating authentic art in America meant potentially becoming a target? Nobody can say for certain, but the timeline is worth noting. The threats, the security, the film's success, and then, gradually, Brando's retreat. Here's what's fascinating, though. The truth about this security detail and these threats didn't emerge until much later. It came out through interviews with producers, through Coppola's later reflections on the film's production, through journalists digging into FBI files that were eventually declassified. The story was always there, but it stayed hidden because everyone had invested interest in keeping it hidden. There's another layer to this that's worth considering. The Godfather changed how organized crime was perceived in America. Before the film, the Mafia existed as something vague and terrifying. After the film, they became almost sympathetic, complex, tragic. The film didn't glorify them, but it did humanize them in a way that was, in some sense, more damaging to law enforcement efforts than pure condemnation would have been. Was that intentional on Coppola's part? On Brando's part, the evidence suggests no. They were trying to make art. They were trying to tell a true story. But the consequence of that truth telling was a subtle transformation in how America saw one of its darkest criminal enterprises. And the people running that enterprise understood exactly what had happened. Some believe the threats were exaggerated over time. Others argue they were far worse than anyone has publicly admitted. But what's undeniable is that Marlon Brando paid a price for his art. Not with his life, perhaps, but with his freedom, with his ability to move through the world anonymously, with a kind of innocence about the consequences of creating powerful work. Marlon Brando is gone now. The Mafia as it existed in 1972 is essentially gone too. The world has changed. The film remains. And that performance, that raspy whisper, that controlled power, that perfectly calibrated portrayal of a man commanding an empire through force of personality rather than explicit violence, that performance endures as one of the greatest achievements in cinema history. But what it cost him to create that performance is something most people never consider. They see the film. They marvel at his genius. They recognize the immortality he achieved. But they don't think about the security detail, the phone calls, the reality that creating great art in America sometimes means becoming a target. Sometimes means sacrificing your own safety for the integrity of a vision. Brando knew this. He understood it from the beginning, and he went forward anyway, not because he was reckless, but because he believed that some truths needed to be told, regardless of the cost. That's the real legacy of The Godfather, at least the part that isn't talked about in film school or in retrospectives. It's not just about the quality of the filmmaking or the brilliance of the performance. It's about an actor and a director who believed that truth mattered more than safety, more than comfort, more than the approval of powerful people. So here's the question for you: what would you risk for the truth? Not your safety necessarily, but your comfort, your standing, your relationships, because that's what Brando risked. And whether you think it was worth it probably depends on what you think the purpose of art really is. Let us know in the comments. And while you're there, tell us which untold Hollywood story you want us to investigate next. Because there are more of them out there. More secrets. More forgotten legends waiting to be remembered. And unfortunately, they don't make men like Marlon Brando anymore.